Her world had shrunk to the size of a copper coin held between thumb and forefinger, hot, small, and tasting of rust. The sun was a hammer and the land was the anvil. She stood where he had left her, at the edge of the dust-blown collection of buildings that called itself a town, a place named Red Creek for a trickle of water that ran sour and red with iron. Her feet, bare and blistered, were planted in the ochre dust, and she did not move. Moving was a choice, and choice was a luxury she had forgotten. He had taken her shoes first. An act of casual cruelty, a way to anchor her to this spot while he went into the saloon to drink away the last of their money. She had watched him go, a man made of sharp angles and sour breath, the man who had taken her mother's name and then her mother's life, leaving only her. A piece of property to be disposed of. She wore a dress the color of dishwater, thin and frayed at the hem, and it clung to her like a second skin, damp with sweat. The people of Red Creek looked. Of course they looked. A woman stood alone in the sun, unmoving like a scarecrow forgotten after the harvest. They saw the hollows under her cheekbones, the vacant geography of her eyes. From the shaded porch of the general store, women in bonnets murmured behind their hands, their words lost to the wind but their judgment as clear as glass. Men leaning against the smithy eyed her with a different kind of appraisal, a weighing and measuring that made her skin crawl. She felt their stares like insects, and she pulled deeper into herself, into the one place they could not touch. A dog, ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel, trotted past, sniffed at her feet, and whined as if it recognized a kinship in her abandonment. She did not look at it. She looked at the horizon, a wavering line where the pale, unforgiving sky met the burnt land. Her throat was a desert of its own. Her silence was a fortress. She had been standing for what felt like a lifetime, each second a grain of sand falling in the hourglass of her endurance. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruises of purple and blood orange. He came back out of the saloon, swaggering. His name was Corvus, and he wore it like a threat. He did not look at her, not at first. He addressed the small, lingering audience of onlookers. His voice was loud, performative, meant to carry. He spoke of debts, of bad luck, of a burden he could no longer carry. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder at her. A gesture of finality. Discarded. She felt a tremor start in her knees, the last of her strength threatening to abandon her. This was it. The end of the road. She would simply stop here. The dust would take her. The night would swallow her. It was a strangely peaceful thought, a release from the long, grinding effort of survival. The crowd murmured, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. No one moved to help. They were watchers, and this was just another small, grim story unfolding in a land full of them. From the deep shade near the stables, a man watched. He had been there all along, unnoticed, quiet as a shadow. He was not a part of the town's chorus. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the tough, weathered wood of the landscape itself. His coat was the color of dust, his boots scuffed and worn. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a stillness that was not empty but heavy. Elias had seen her when she first arrived, a ghost tethered to a loud, cruel man. He had seen the way she stood, not defiant but enduring. It was a posture he recognized. It was the posture of survival when everything else had been stripped away. He had turned his back, telling himself it was not his affair. He had enough ghosts of his own. His farm was a quiet place, a place for endings, not beginnings. But as Corvus made his final pronouncement and turned to leave her to the mercy of the elements and the circling vultures, both human and avian, something in Elias shifted. It was not a grand, heroic impulse. It was a quiet, insistent ache, a thread of decency that had not yet frayed completely. He remembered another woman's face, pale and feverish, and a promise he had made to her in the dark to never stand by while suffering went unanswered. A promise he had failed to keep in the years since she'd gone. He pushed himself off the wall he was leaning against. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked not toward the girl, but toward Corvus, who was about to mount his horse. Every eye in Red Creek turned to him. Silence fell, thick and waiting. Elias stopped a few feet from Corvus. He didn't raise his voice. It was low, rough, like stones grinding together. You owe Jedediah at the mercantile for 3 months of feed. Corvus squinted, thrown by the change of subject. What's that to you? And you owe me for the plowshare I forged for you last spring, Elias continued, his voice flat, unemotional. You said you were good for it. A sneer twisted Corvus's lips. Times are hard. Elias's gaze flickered for a second to the girl, still standing like a statue in the dying light, and then back to Corvus. Settle your debt. I've got nothing, Corvus spat, gesturing around at the dusty street. You've got her, Elias said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of stones. A gasp went through the small crowd. It was a transaction, cold and simple. A horse, a sack of grain, a human life. The currency of the frontier. Corvus stared, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. He saw an angle. A way to come out of this looking not like a man abandoning his stepdaughter, but a man settling his affairs. She's worth more than a damned plowshare. Elias reached into his worn coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and emptied a few coins into his palm. They weren't much. Barely enough for a week's worth of supplies. But he held them out. This and the debt is cleared. Corvus looked at the coins, then at the girl, then back at the coins. Greed won. He snatched the coins from Elias's hand and swung himself up onto his horse. He gave the girl one last look, a look of pure contempt. She's your problem now, he said, and without another word he spurred his horse and rode out of town, the dust rising behind him like a pack of following ghosts. Elias stood for a moment, the coins fading warmth still on his palm. He did not look at the crowd. He put the empty pouch back in his coat. Then he turned. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the way she held herself, braced for a blow that hadn't come. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, a tiny spark in the vast emptiness. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a kind word. The space between them was charged with the unspoken. He simply nodded his head once, a short, sharp gesture toward the road leading away from Red Creek, the road that led to his homestead. Then he turned and began to walk, his stride even and unhurried. He didn't look back to see if she was following. The choice, small as it was now hers. For a long moment she remained frozen. Her mind was a whirlwind of dust and confusion. This man, this stranger, had bought her. The word tasted like ash. But Corvus was gone. The immediate threat had vanished, replaced by a vast, terrifying unknown. She looked at the man's retreating back, a solitary figure walking into the twilight. Then she looked at the faces of the townspeople, their curiosity now curdling into suspicion. There was no safety here. Her feet, screaming with pain, took a single, hesitant step. Then another. She followed the silent man out of town, leaving the whispers and the stares behind. The space he had left for her was a physical release from the prison of public shame. She was no longer an object on display. She was simply a person walking behind another person into the gathering dark. The journey was a silent pilgrimage. The sun had bled out completely, leaving a sky strewn with stars as sharp and cold as chips of ice. The man, Elias, walked ahead, his pace steady. He carried a single sack of supplies slung over his shoulder. He never looked back, but she felt his awareness of her, a quiet presence that was neither threatening nor comforting. It simply was. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the crunch of their footsteps on the dry ground, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, and the vast, open hum of the desert at night. Her thoughts, which had been a numb static, slowly began to clear. Fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in her belly, but for the first time in a long time it was not the sharp, immediate fear of a fist or a harsh word. It was the dull, sprawling fear of the unknown. After an hour, he stopped. He shrugged the sack from his shoulder and pulled out a metal canteen. He drank, then held it out to her, his arm extended fully, closing the space between them for the first time. She hesitated, watching his hand in the moonlight. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, but it was steady. She took the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, small and electric, went through her. It was the first human touch in months that wasn't a shove or a grab. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever known. It sluiced the dust from her throat, a cool balm on a raw wound. She drank until she could breathe again, then handed it back. She tried to form the words "thank you," but her throat closed around them and used to the shape of gratitude. She met his eyes for a second. In the dim light, she could not read their expression. He simply took the canteen, capped it, and started walking again. They walked for what felt like most of the night. The landscape was monochrome, a world of silver and shadow. Finally, silhouetted against the rising moon, a shape emerged from the flat plains. It was a house, or the suggestion of one. A small, low structure built of sod and rough-hewn timber hunkered down against the earth as if trying to hide from the vastness of the sky. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign he had banked the fire before leaving. It was a place of profound isolation. There were no other lights, no other signs of life for miles in any direction. A broken-down wagon sat beside a small, struggling corral. A single, lean horse stood within it, head drooping. The entire homestead seemed to be holding its breath. Elias pushed open the heavy plank door, which scraped against the floor. He stood aside to let her enter. The inside was one room. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and loneliness. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a few embers glowing softly in the ash. A rough table and 2 stools stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patch quilt, was tucked into one corner. In the other, near the fire, was a small cot. He gestured toward the cot. "That's yours." It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. His voice sounded like it came from under floorboards deep and seldom used. She looked at the cot, a simple frame with a thin mattress and a single, coarse blanket. It was the first space she had been given, the first place that was meant to be hers in longer than she could remember. He moved to the hearth and stirred the embers, adding a few small pieces of wood. A flame flickered, then caught, casting their long, dancing shadows against the walls. He took a small pot, filled it with water from a bucket by the door, and set it on a hook over the fire. He didn't speak again. She stood by the door, uncertain, feeling like a ghost that had wandered into the wrong house. He had bought her. He had brought her here. What did he expect? The fear, which had dulled to a low hum, sharpened again. She watched his back as he worked, every muscle in her body tensed. He seemed to sense her fear without looking. "The door doesn't lock," he said, his voice quiet, still focused on the fire. "Never has." The words were a strange sort of reassurance. He wasn't telling her she was safe. He was telling her she was not a prisoner. He was giving her the knowledge of the unlocked door, another small choice in a world that had offered her none. He took 2 bowls from a shelf and ladled a thin, watery stew into them. He placed one on the table and then the other. He sat on one of the stools and looked at her, waiting. Slowly, she moved toward the table. Her legs ached, her feet were a mess of raw cuts and blisters. She sat on the stool opposite him. The stew was little more than broth with a few vegetables, but the warmth from the bowl seeped into her cold hands. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against pottery and the crackling of the fire. The unspoken contract was being drawn up between them, not in words but in bowls of stew and the shared space of a single, quiet room. He had offered her shelter. He had offered her food. He had offered her an unlocked door. For now it was enough. The days settled into a rhythm as slow and steady as a distant drumbeat. Morning came with a sliver of gray light through the single, small window. Elias would rise first, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. He would mend fences that the wind was always trying to claim, tend to his weary horse, or work the small patch of stubborn ground he called a garden. He moved like a man who had made peace with endless, repetitive labor. She would wake to the smell of the fire being rekindled. Her first few days were a blur of exhaustion. She slept on the cot, a deep, dreamless sleep that was a balm to her battered body and soul. When she was awake, she watched him. She learned the landscape of his silence, the way he would pause and stare at the horizon, the way his hands, though rough, were gentle with the horse. Slowly, cautiously, she began to find her place in the small cabin. It started with sweeping the floor. The first time she picked up the worn broom, he stopped what he was doing and watched her for a moment. He didn't say anything, just gave a slight nod and went back to his work. The simple act of sweeping the packed earth floor was an anchor. It was a task. It was purpose. She found a rhythm in cleaning, mending, and cooking. Their meals were meager: stew, hard biscuits, the occasional potato roasted in the coals, but she learned to make them. She found a small stash of thread and needles and began mending his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a fragile tapestry of shared existence. He never told her what to do. He would simply leave a bucket that needed filling by the door or a pile of vegetables on the table. He let her find the work herself, to claim it as her own. And in doing so, he gave her back a piece of her agency, bit by tiny bit. One afternoon, while he was out checking his snares, she wandered a little distance from the cabin. Behind the house, hidden by a small cluster of junipers, was a single grave. It was marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered and gray. At its base, someone had placed a ring of smooth, white stones. The earth was kept clear of weeds. It was a place of quiet, constant care. She knew, without needing to be told, who rested there. She stood before the grave for a long time. She thought of her own mother, buried in an unmarked plot miles and years away. She felt a kinship with the silent occupant of this grave, the woman whose place in this small world she now occupied. She found a single, stubborn wildflower growing by the fence line, a splash of defiant yellow against the brown earth. She picked it and gently laid it among the white stones on the grave. It was a small gesture, an offering to the ghost that haunted this place, an acknowledgement of the loss that had carved the hollowness into Elias's eyes. When he returned, he didn't mention the flower. But that evening, as they sat by the fire, he was carving a piece of wood. It was something he often did, his hands busy while his mind was elsewhere. When he was done, he silently placed the small, crudely carved shape of a bird on the mantelpiece above the hearth. The next morning, she noticed he had moved it to the small sill of the window nearest her cot. The small, unspoken kindnesses became a language of their own. She would leave a cup of hot water for him when he came in from the cold. He would leave a piece of dried fruit by her plate. One day, he came back from a rare trip to Red Creek and silently handed her a pair of sturdy leather boots. They were used, but the leather was soft and well-oiled. They fit as if they were made for her. She put them on and for the first time felt grounded, connected to the earth. On that same trip, he had faced the whispers. He'd heard them in the general store as he bought flour and salt. That his woman now? Heard he bought her, he had turned, his gaze sweeping over the murmuring townspeople. His voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. She's under my protection. Anyone has a problem with that, they have a problem with me. No one met his eye. The whispers died. He never told her about it. But she noticed the next time they had to go into town for supplies. No one stared. They looked away, their judgment now mixed with a healthy dose of fear. The true thaw came on a night when the wind turned mean, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised, angry purple. A sudden clap of thunder, loud enough to shake the very foundations of the small house, jolted her from a shallow sleep. She wasn't in the cabin. She was back in Corvus's wagon, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and his rage. He was yelling, his face a mask of fury. The world was shrinking, the darkness pressing in. She cried out, a small, strangled sound, and sat bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the dying embers in the hearth. She was trembling, the phantom fear clinging to her like wet paper. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. A floorboard creaked. Elias was standing by the hearth, a silhouette against the faint light. He didn't speak. He simply took a log from the woodpile and placed it gently on the embers. He coaxed it with a poker until small flames began to lick at the dry bark. The fire grew, pushing back the shadows, filling the small room with a warm, steady light. He didn't come to her. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He sat on one of the stools by the hearth, his back to her, and simply kept watch. He was a silent guardian, a steady presence in the storm, both outside and within her. His quiet vigil was more comforting than any touch or word could have been. It told her she was not alone in the dark. Slowly, her trembling subsided. The frantic beating of her heart slowed to a steady rhythm, matching the calm crackle of the fire. She watched his back, the solid, unmoving line of his shoulders. The question had been building in her for weeks, a silent weight in her chest. Now, in the fragile safety of the firelight, it surfaced. Her voice, when she spoke, was thin as a fence rail, rough with disuse and sleep. Why? He didn't turn around. He stared into the flames, as if the answer was written there. A long moment passed. My wife, Sarah, he said, his voice low and heavy. She was a fighter, right to the end. I saw some of that in you. Standing there in the dust. I couldn't just walk away. It wasn't an answer full of love or passion. It was an answer rooted in grief, in honor, in a debt to a memory. And it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She pulled the coarse blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fear from the nightmare had receded, replaced by a strange, fragile warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the beginning of trust. She didn't have any more words. He didn't seem to need them. They sat in the shared silence, listening to the fire and the wind until the first light of dawn broke through the clouds and the storm passed. The fragile piece they had built was a glass house on the prairie, beautiful and clear, but always vulnerable. The harbinger of its shattering was not a letter, not a writer, but a simple glint of sunlight on metal far out on the horizon. Elias saw it first. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar heartbeat for their homestead. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and his eyes, trained by years of watching the empty plains, caught the movement. One glint, then another. Riders. 3 of them. They were moving too purposefully to be lost travelers. They were coming for them. A cold dread settled in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, who it was. He dropped the axe and walked to the cabin. She was inside, kneading dough for their daily bread, her hands covered in flour. She looked up when he entered, a question in her eyes. She had come to read his moods, his silences, and she saw the new tension in his shoulders. Go inside, he said, his voice flat. Stay away from the window. He didn't need to say more. She saw the look on his face and her blood ran cold. The half-formed loaf of bread sat abandoned on the floured board. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements suddenly jerky. The ghost she thought they had exorcised was riding back to claim them. Elias took his rifle down from the hooks above the door. He checked the load, his movements economical and grim. He walked back outside and stood on the small, rickety porch, the rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He was not an aggressor. He was a man standing on his own land waiting. The riders grew from distant specks into 3 distinct figures. In the lead, unmistakable, was Corvus. He rode with the same arrogant slouch, flanked by 2 men who looked like they were rented for their cruelty. They pulled up about 20 yards from the cabin, turning the quiet homestead into a battleground. Corvus surveyed the scene with a contemptuous smirk. He saw the small, poor cabin, the single horse, the man standing alone. He had come to reclaim what he saw as his property. Elias, he called out, his voice oily with false familiarity. I've come for the girl. She's not a girl, Elias said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. And she's not yours. We had a deal, Corvus sneered, his eyes glittering. You paid a debt. You didn't buy her. She's my stepdaughter. The law says she's my responsibility. I'm here to take her back. His argument was a flimsy cover of legality and social contract, a justification for his greed and wounded pride. The law has long ears, Elias replied calmly. It might hear how you left her to die in Red Creek. Corvus's face darkened. That's my word against yours. And who are you? A broken-down dirt farmer with a ghost in his backyard. Now send her out? No, Elias said. The word was simple, absolute. A stone wall. Corvus's patience snapped. I'm not asking. He made a move to dismount, one of his men reaching for the pistol at his hip. In that moment, the cabin door creaked open. She stepped out. She was not the same woman they had seen in Red Creek. The hollows in her face had filled out. Her eyes, though wide with fear, were not vacant. They were alive. And in her hands she held the heavy, cast-iron skillet, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles were white. She walked to stand beside Elias. Not behind him, but beside him. She didn't say a word. She just lifted her chin and met Corvus's gaze, the skillet held like a shield. Corvus stared, momentarily stunned. He had expected a cowering, broken creature he could easily drag away. He had expected to deal with one tired old man. He had not expected this. This unified front. This silent, defiant woman who looked ready to split his skull open with her cookware. His bravado faltered. Bullies are cowards at their core, and the fight had just become more complicated than he'd anticipated. She's made her choice, Elias said, his voice still quiet but now edged with steel. This is her home. You are not welcome here. Leave. Corvus looked from Elias's steady rifle to the woman's unyielding stance and the primitive, brutal weapon in her hands. He looked at their faces, 2 separate people who had somehow become a single, impenetrable fortress. He saw he would not win this without blood, and it might well be his own. He let out a string of curses, his voice full of impotent rage. He gestured angrily to his men. This ain't over, he spat, but the threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around so violently it reared, and the 3 of them galloped away, their retreat as ignominious as their arrival. They stood together on the porch, watching until the dust settled and the riders were gone. The silence that descended was vast, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. The skillet suddenly felt immensely heavy. Her hands started to tremble, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Elias gently took the skillet from her hands and set it down on the porch railing. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something close to a smile in his tired eyes. It was a look of profound respect. You didn't run, he said softly. She looked at the small cabin, at the land around it, at the endless sky. It was a harsh, unforgiving place. But it was the first place she had been allowed to put down roots, however shallow. This is my home, she whispered, the words feeling new and powerful on her tongue. They went inside. The loaf of bread was still on the table, forgotten. She looked at it, then at Elias. A small, dry laugh escaped her. That loaf died in vain. He looked at her, a real smile touching his lips this time. We'll make another. That night, after a meal that felt like a celebration, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was different now. It was not a space to be filled, but a comfort to be shared. The threat had been faced and repelled, not by his strength alone, but by theirs together. The fragile glass house had been tested, and it had held. The bond, forged in silence and solidified in defiance, was now unbreakable. A few days after the confrontation, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Elias turned to her. He had been quiet for a long time, carving another piece of wood. "You never told me your name," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. The name she had been given at birth was tied to a life she wanted to forget. It belonged to the girl in the dishwater dress, the girl left in the dust. It was a name that tasted of fear and ash. "I don't have one," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not one I want to keep." He nodded slowly, as if he understood completely. He looked out at the fading light, the way it softened the harsh lines of the land, making it look almost gentle. When Sarah was sick, he began, his voice rough with memory she used to talk about the light. How even on the darkest days, there was always a little bit of it somewhere. You just had to be willing to see it. He looked back at her, his eyes clear. "Lena. It means light." He didn't say, "I will call you Lena." He offered it to her, a gift. Lena. She tried the name out in the silence of her mind. It felt clean. It felt new. It felt like her own. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Lena," she repeated softly. It was an acceptance. A beginning. In that moment, she was no longer the girl he had rescued. She was Lena. And he was Elias. They were two people with names, with a home. The next morning, they took the tattered, gray dress she had arrived in. They didn't speak of it. They both knew what needed to be done. They built a small fire away from the house, and Elias handed her the dress. She held it for a moment, the thin, flimsy material a reminder of all she had endured. Then she dropped it into the flames. They watched together as the fire consumed it, the gray cloth turning black, then curling into ash and smoke that drifted up into the vast, blue sky. It was a funeral for the ghost of who she used to be. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Something new was. Afterward, they walked to the section of fence Corvus's horse had damaged in its hasty retreat. A post was splintered, the rails sagging. Together, they worked to fix it. He dug a new post hole, his muscles straining. She held the new post steady while he packed the earth around it, her hands firm and sure. They were rebuilding their sanctuary, mending the tear in their world with their own two hands. Life settled back into its rhythm, but the rhythm had changed. It was deeper now, more resonant. The silences were comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. The small gestures of care continued, but they were no longer tentative. They were the threads of a life they were weaving together, strong and resilient. One evening, Lena found an old, empty nail on the wall by the hearth. The next day, she hung a small bundle of dried wildflowers from it. A splash of color and life in the Spartan room. The house, which had once felt haunted by loss, began to feel lived in. It began to breathe again. The story doesn't end with a wedding, or a grand declaration of love shouted from the rooftops. Love, for them, was not a sudden storm. It was the slow, steady soaking rain that brings a parched land back to life. It was in the bread she baked, the way it was no longer a little dry. It was in the wood he carved for her. A perfect, smooth bird that fit in the palm of her hand. It was in the way he would look up from his work and find her watching him, and the way they would both smile, a small, shared secret. The final image is not one of drama, but of deep, abiding peace. Months have passed. It is a cool evening, and they are sitting together on the porch they rebuilt. The air is clean, the sky is a tapestry of stars. Lena is mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. Elias is leaning back in his chair, his eyes closed, listening to the night sounds. The house behind them is warm, a single lamp glowing in the window like a beacon. There is no fear here. There is no shame. There is only the quiet, powerful truth of two broken souls who, in saving each other, had finally found their way home. So you see, the story. It ain't just about a rescue in some dusty, forgotten town. It's about the fact that a home isn't always a place you're born into. Sometimes it's a place you build, nail by nail, meal by meal, with another lost soul. It's about the quiet courage it takes to accept a kindness and the profound strength it takes to offer one. We all carry a name we were given. Some of us, we carry names that taste like ash, names tied to a past that tried to break us. But here's the secret they don't tell you: you get to choose. You get to burn the old rags of who you were and stand in the clean, open air of who you decide to be. So here's your naming. It's whatever word feels like light. Look around. In the quiet places, in the people who stand their ground not with loud words but with steady presence, you might find your own Elias. In the strength you didn't know you had until you were tested, you might find your Lena. And if you're brave enough, if you're quiet enough to listen past the noise of the world, you might just find that the most powerful words of all are the ones that are never spoken in a home you built from the dust up.